Chapter 34. The Original Woman: Witch, Rebel, Midwife, and Healer. What would it have been like if patriarchy had never happened? To get an idea, we have to comprehend the first law of matriarchy. Women control our own bodies. This would seem a basic premise to any fully evolved human culture, which is why primate patriarchy is based on its denial. Children were generally welcome in matrifocal society, as there was enough food for all, and children could help in agricultural and craft work. When childbearing is not a punishment but self chosen, and when raising children is not an economic survival disaster, most of us enjoy being around children. Most men do too. In pre patriarchal cultures, children were raised communally, not closed up within four nuclear walls, not as property, but as the fruit of all. Most of all, childbearing and child raising were a part of each woman's life, a nourishing as well as nurturing part, but not her whole life. When women control our bodies, our daily lives, our environment, and our goals, we don't inflict on ourselves the terrible split between motherhood and self realization that patriarchy and the nuclear family inflict upon us. This split is a structural one, indigenous to male dominated environments. In matriarchy, women could be mothers and also enjoy other energies and interests. Men who envied women, our capacity to bear children and also do other things, turned around and invented patriarchy, in which motherhood is structured as an all consuming burden. Men knew they could never bear children, but they could try to keep us from doing anything else. But women don't always want children, and for a multitude of reasons best determined by women. So, in matristic cultures, there were a number of magic rites and techniques in use that contributed to fertility control. Women always had knowledge of herbal contraceptives and abortifacs, as well as narcotics and muscle relaxants, like raspberry tea, that could ease childbirth. When women are in natural control of our own fertility, population is always kept in practical relation to the needs of the group and the abundance of the environment. That, after all, is what it's all about. Since time immemorial, since the beginning of human time, the arts of gynecology, midwifery, and the holistic herbal healing, including birth control, were wholly female domains, guarded by the Neanderthal women, the Cro-Magnon women, the Neolithic women, the priestesses of the great goddess. Contraception and abortion can become illegal only when, in patriarchal class society, church, and state, define it so for their own purposes. And what are their purposes? Large populations that drive the wages and value of labor down, masses of people kept in ignorance and wretchedness, out of which come male cannon fodder and female prostitutes and brood mares to service their wars. Patriarchy is based on cynical male control of female reproduction and the resultant ugliness of such a culture there for all to see. When women practiced their own medicine, thus controlling their own bodies, such a state could not come into existence. One of the major weapons of patriarchy was the establishment of a closed male medical profession that barred women from practicing their ancient herbal medicine and gynecological skills. In medieval Europe, this elite male medical profession was the joint creation of the royal courts and the Christian church, which joined together to create the European court state and the political machinery to break the power of the people on the land, the peasants, the pagans, the people of the witches. Because women value the quality of life experienced by children, women throughout history have done what they could to keep the population in balance with environment. Herbal and mechanical contraception is one method. Abortion has been another. Tribal women throughout the world nurse their babies for 4 years. During this time, might have had no sexual relations with a man, using such means to space out children. Tribal women averaged 4 children in their reproductive lifetimes, each child receiving the maximum of intense maternal physical and emotional care during the critical years. No method is ideal. Some are extreme, But when contraception and abortion are not practiced, the early results are even more extreme: infanticide, malnutrition, infant starvation, death, mass famine. No woman making her own choices would deliberately bear children only to see them starve to death. Among people practicing abortion, even infanticide, the spirit of the dead child was returned to the earth womb to await a new birth, partaking still in the substance of the Great Mother. It was not lost, but to the well being of the living group, it was maintained. Patriarchy arose among the cattle breeders who had discovered the male role in contraception. They believed that the entire life force was in male semen, and that the female womb served only as the vessel for the male seed, which was elevated to the Father God. So, among Near Eastern Father God religions, the child had value only as proof of male potency, and only insofar as it had been given into his ideological power. Catholics and fundamentalist Protestants believe that children dying without baptism into their religions have no souls and no salvation. The unbaptized dead infant remains forever in limbo. In the past, Semitic Jewish or Muslim children who died without being named, circumcised, or otherwise ritually recognized by their fathers were buried or burnt without ceremony, i.e., these children had identity only as the father's property. Today, the Catholic Church maintains that humans, including fetuses, receive life entirely from God the Father. The 10 months of biological labor put into this child by the mother mean nothing. She is just a vessel. Pope Paul announced in 1972 that no woman has the right to abortion, even if her life depends on it, even if she has other children who might need her, even if she's a fully grown, conscious human being who might desire to live. He was therefore claiming that the fetus, always considered potentially male, is more sacred than the human mother who bears it within her body. Why? She is only female, but the fetus comes from God, the big bull stud in the sky. In March 1984, a pregnant Irish woman in Dundalk died from a reoccurrence of cancer, surrounded by Catholic doctors who refused to give her any treatment for fear of damaging the fetus. At the time of her death, she had tumors on her legs, neck, and spine, but the doctors had refused to x-ray her, refused to give her any painkillers, refused all treatments absolutely. She died 2 days after delivering a premature baby who died at birth. Can we really believe that celibate priests care so much about the lives of infants? Or is it that their true concern is to maintain absolute control over the bodies of women, since it is upon this control that their entire religion is based? Feminists say if men could get pregnant, abortion would be a sacrament. Women must understand, because men cannot get pregnant, their next move is to establish patriarchal religion, whose major sacrament is to make childbearing a punishment for sex, a punishment for being female. Certainly, it was not so in the ancient matriarchies. The earliest recorded abortion recipes yet found date circa from 2700 BC. They were inscribed on Egyptian papyrus scrolls. From Egypt came the first known medical texts, and among them were prescriptions for contraceptive substances meant to be inserted into the vagina. Very likely, they knew of temporarily sterilizing herbal potions that women could take. After all, the hormone progesterone, now used in birth control, exists naturally in various plants. Today's multi-billion-dollar birth control industry was originally built on 2 yam roots found in Mexico. The Talmudic Jews invented the vaginal sponge, which was in use, soaked in oil, until the invention of the Dutch cap by a woman doctor in Holland in the 1880s. Pessary means stone. Oriental farmers and travelers knew that if a small object like a stone was inserted into the womb of a female camel or other domestic animal, she would not conceive. Native healers on Java traditionally inserted a small object into the wombs of women for the same purposes, the original IUD. In ancient Rome and Greece, vinegar or lemon juice were used as acid spermicides, and one half of the squeezed out lemon is a pretty good cap. Native American women knew plants and root concoctions to make for temporary sterility, for abortion, as well as childbirth ease. All African and worldwide Aboriginal people the same. It would seem that at no time in history have women been so totally oppressed in their sexuality, kept so ignorant of the contraceptive methods while forced into compulsory yearly childbearing as in the so-called civilized societies of the Christian West. As Dr. Margaret Murray pointed out, in the 1930s, modern ideas of the witch are based entirely on Inquisition trial records of the 16th to 18th centuries, when the European Christian church was totally mobilized to crush out remains of Western paganism. The stereotype was eagerly reinforced by the European medical professions, who saw the witches, who were also herbal healers and midwives, as economic rivals. Before these wholesale purges and repressions, many of the great early European doctors of medicine and pharmacology, like Paracelsus, claimed openly that they had learned all they knew of healing and drugs directly from women's witchcraft. The Wiccan or wise women practiced the ancient Dianic religion and functioned as midwives and healers to the common people and the peasantry. Throughout the European countryside, the sage femme was called in childbirth. These women were highly skilled, and it is on record that some could perform cesarean sections with complete success for the mother and child. But during the late Middle Ages, dominated by the Christian Inquisition, the delivery of a pregnant woman was no longer considered a sacrament, but a dirty business. And the women who attended the poor at childbirth were frequently considered social outcasts or worse. They were charged with witchcraft, tortured, and burned. One witch was burned alive in Scotland for the sole crime of bathing some neighborhood children for hygienic reasons in the midst of an epidemic. Healthcare and healing were publicly discouraged by the Christian Church, which officially believed that life was supposed to be diseased, wretched, and painful, and this was God's will, a punishment for human sin. People who tried to alleviate suffering or cure illness, especially through ancient folk and herbal medicine or simple hygiene, were suspected to be agents of the devil. In Egypt, circa 3000 BC, both female and male priest doctors had helped women in childbirth. But in medieval Europe, midwifery was considered a crime for men and probably a sign of witchcraft for women. Witch hunts coincided with the rise of specialist male and medical professions that were instigated by celibate monks whose minds were inflamed with the most psychotic and sexual hatred of women. During the early Renaissance, medicine claimed more scientific, a new male profession. Subject discovered the gold mine of obstetrics. Even midwifery began to be surrounded by educational requirements from which women were excluded. Male midwives appeared in Europe, and doctors insisted on being consulted during childbirth. These were the same professional medics who later demanded that laboring women enter hospital wards and then moved from corpse autopsies to childbirth beds, spreading infection to women and causing higher mother mortality rates than had ever existed in pagan Europe. The modern male medical professions rose on the ashes of the burnt witches. These women were vilified in every way that clerical tongue or pen or torture instrument could inflict, and luridly accused of everything of making men both lustful and impotent, of helping women in labor, of depopulating Christendom by strangling newborn babies. In 1486, it was officially declared that no one has done more harm to the Catholic faith than the midwives. And there was truth in this accusation. European women living in wretched poverty and condemned to unending pregnancy was the church's celibate male priesthood. They had no greater friends than the sage femmes, the wise women midwives, who told them how to prevent conception, with herbs to use for abortion and how to ease labor pain. As the church rightfully suspected, the midwives also often neglected to properly baptize the newborn into Christian faith. All this gave the women a certain autonomy and control over their own bodies. And this power threatened the power of the male priests, the father church, the father state. Midwives were witches, and the witchcraft was high treason against God's nouveau male majesty. The Christian male hierarchy, both Catholic and Protestant, which was developing during this time, was intent on establishing total dominion over the innermost thoughts of the European people. The Inquisition was the instrument of this domination. Witches were independent of mind. They were of the people. They served the goddess, the native goddess of the Neolithic Europe, not a male god imposed by Roman imperialism. Their covens were correctly suspected to be meeting places for revolutionary peasants. Joan of Arc was legendarily a member of witch coven. In every small village or city or neighborhood, the witch was the spiritual and political rival of the local priest and the imperial church. She offered real healing through ancient tested herbal knowledge, while the priest could only give slogans, promising relief in heaven or punishment in hell. Medieval Christianity taught that this world was the devil's excrement, our flesh, the home of the original sin, and our lives an evil to be despised and endured. With the church's disruption of the old ways, human life in Europe was indeed becoming quite ugly. Countering this, the witch kept alive the ancient pagan nature wisdom and cyclic rhythms. Dances, songs, belief, lore, and skills celebrating the sacredness of life and the ecstasy of earth. The people followed the witches who always had better music and more delight. The Hebrew god Yahweh in Genesis 3:16 had condemned Eve for her disobedience. I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow shalt you bring forth children. And so, according to the church, it should be. To the male priesthood and celibate monks, women alone was sexual. Her genitals were fearsome and unclean, and childbirth disgusting and unholy. To Christian clerics, original sin adhered to intrinsically to orgasmic experience. To the fact of female genitalia, children were born dirty and the results of the dirt of sexual conception. Testament, on the other hand, comes from Latin testes, testicle, male witness. In Childbirth Without Fear in 1942, Dr. Grantley Dickery declares that there can be no more horrible stigma upon our civilization than the history of childbirth. Long after anesthetics were medically available, and as late as the mid-19th century, the clerical and medical authorities opposed any methods that might relieve women's suffering during labor. Women were meant to suffer greatly as God's punishment for our collective sin. Witches were accused and arrested, tortured, and burned for the crime of helping women in labor with herbs and muscle-relaxing techniques. Such womanly help was a dreadful and imperious act of the will of God. And as Martin Luther, founder of Protestantism, stated, if a woman grows weary and at last dies from childbearing, it matters not. Let her die from bearing. She is there to do it. In ancient society and among primitive people still, laboring women sat in a squatting position, actively in charge of the body's creative work. In the modern West, until yesterday, the Christian tradition of passive suffering prevailed in the labor room. The woman lying on her back, usually strapped down in cruelly impersonal hospital environments, while a male doctor delivered her child. Woman bears the pain, the man takes the credit for the deliverance. We now know that the strapped-down legs and stirrup position was the invention of the French King Louis, who mandated it throughout his kingdom because he was royally turned on by watching women in labor. With feminism and women's rediscovery of home birth, midwifery, and drug-free delivery, this situation has in the past decade radically changed. As recently as 1971, midwifery and home birth were virtually illegal and or practically unobtainable in most of American states. Now, women have heroically received the occupation of midwife, established comfortable birthing centers, and forced hospitals to compete by offering women more comfort and autonomy in hospital delivery wards. Though midwifery and home birth have become common practices in the 20th century Western Europe, the American medical profession fought them vigorously, perhaps accounting for the fact that America in the recent past ranked 17th in newborn mortality rates among the Western nations. American women's successful fight so far to return childbirth to mother and child is reversing the statistic and also helping to re-empower women on the most basic level of becoming acquainted with our own bodies. One giant step for womankind. During the time of the Catholic-dominated Europe, it was also a crime against God to miscarry. Even if a woman miscarried after an accident or after being beaten by her husband, she could still be put to death for her sin against the father, because all miscarriages were suspected by the clergy of being intentional abortions. Celibate clergy always tended to believe that women were guilty until proven dead. When Spanish Catholics colonized the American West, forcibly missionizing the Western tribes, it was the custom for the Native American women who miscarried for any reason to be punished by being whipped and publicly humiliated for their sin before the church door. It was believed, sometimes correctly, that the Indian women would practice abortion in order to rob the church of Indian slave labor, and the priest of God could not allow this. The same mentality was practiced against European women for centuries by the Father Church. Wherever male religious and political systems are based in the control of women's reproduction, women must live like this. According to the Bible, rebellion is a sin against the sin of witchcraft. Samuel 15:23. All those who follow the ancient original religion, refusing to be dominated and dichotomized by the female god father god ideology, are defined as evil rebels belonging to the devil and are to be put to death according to God's will. In the Bible, for the first time, we see God's will, i.e., the male primate will to control female reproduction, used as a political tool to crush believers of other religions, women's religions. The fanatic misogyny of both Christianity and Islam originated, as did both these religions, in the Bible. Or, as women of the women's movement of the 1970s said, "You are a witch by being female, untamed, angry, joyous, and immortal." The Wiccan nature, or witchcraft, is the original nature of all women, deriving from our primary biological experience, our psychic relationship with the earth and the cosmos. It is this experience, this relationship, that patriarchy sets out to destroy. But women cannot change our nature. We can only try to forget it, repress it, or follow it under constant threat of punishment by the dominating male order. About a modern-day African witch, it is said, if she is lucky enough that her psychic powers are strong, she can live a normal life. There is a constant fear amongst her husband's relatives that she will use her powers to revenge her humiliating situation as a wife. Isolated as she is among hostile strangers in the patriarchal land, in the patriarchal family, removed by patrilocal custom from her own maternal kin group. With quiescent psychic powers, of course, any woman's normal life is one of submission. In part of west coast of Africa, tribes remained matriarchal until well into the 10th century. When forced into patriarchal organization from the outside through Islamic invasion, many African women chose to run away with Muslim slave traders rather than become wives. So, the witch alive under patriarchy is always under suspicion for having caused the sterility of her husband, or death, disease, or bad luck among her in-laws, or bad weather, or bad crops. Or, in a more fundamentalist situation, she is always under suspicion as a willful seductress of good men, a tool of evil nature, or the devil, designed by death and darkness to undermine and destroy what men call their civilization. Her genuine range and depth of creative powers are denied or forbidden. She lives in a man-made situation where she can only use her negative powers, and for that she is punished and damned. Patriarchy sets her up as the universal scapegoat for all problems, imagined or real, thus removing from all men in her vicinity the terrible burden of thought. During the 500 years of Inquisition, representing the triumph of Christian imperialism over pagan Europe, a woman could either become totally subservient as a wife, beaten and bullied by her husband, her eyes to the ground as the priests and preachers condemned and blamed her for sex of all things, or she could stand straight, proud in her own woman wisdom, and be burnt as a witch.